You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey Vet Rehabbers, today I chat with Ashley Foster from Complete Canine Training and Behavior. This year Ashley did a webinar for us called Advances in Training and Behavior, Integrating Behavior Understanding into Your Practice. So for the online Pet Health members, that's available as a recording on the portal, so you guys must go check it out. I really think as Vet Rehabbers, it's our responsibility to make sure we are creating a safe, relaxing environment for all our patients. And we know that when they are relaxed, we can treat them so much easier and we get so much better outcomes. So before I head over to my chat with Ashley, a quick word from our sponsors. PulseVet are the global leaders in veterinary shockwave technology. They manufacture the ProPulse and Versatron family of products. Now, for those of you that don't know what shockwave therapy is, it's a non-invasive, high-energy sound wave therapy and can be used in both large and small animals. And it's mainly to treat multiple soft tissue injuries as well as musculoskeletal conditions. Now, with over 20 years of clinical research, PulseVet is used by top vets and vet rehabbers to improve the quality and speed of healing, to relieve pain, stimulate bone and tissue growth, and improve mobility for their patients. For more info, you can go to pulsevet.com. Now, in my chat with Ashley, she gives us loads and loads of canine enrichment ideas. That's the topic for today. She gives us ideas and ways in which we can enrich those post-operative cases, our senior dogs, and even our paralyzed patients, and just general ways in which we can enhance enrichment in our practice. Over to Ashley. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today.
Ashley, for the listeners, can you tell them a bit about yourself?
Yes. I am a certified behavior consultant located in the United States, with my businesses based out of Colorado. I have been doing dog training and behavior consulting for 26 years now, which seems wild. And in that, there, of course, has been a ton of progression in understanding and methodologies and the application of the methods that we use. At the core of it, I've been on a journey, right? I used to start out doing a lot of performance and that sort of thing. And as I've evolved as a trainer, my focus really becomes on enhancing the quality of life for both dogs and the people that they share their lives. So that's really what my passion is how do we create really good, healthy relationships between dogs and people?
Awesome. So we're going to be chatting today about enrichment.
Yes.
Can you first just tell us all the different types of enrichment that we have?
Yeah, so there's quite a few different ones. And I'll explain first what enrichment actually is for those. I'm sure everybody has some idea, but the idea is that we are involving making adjustments to the dog's environment and to the way that they interact with their world. That's the way that I like to really define enrichment. Overall, of course, we're looking to enhance the mental and physical wellness of the animals that we live with. So often their worlds are quite small, just living in the human realm. They're behind fences and on leashes and all of those things. So a lot of their innate needs can get blocked. So our goal in doing enrichment, like I said, is to increase mental and physical wellness. When it comes to enrichment, we do have, of course, environmental enrichment of making adjustments and changes to their environment. And there are direct interactions that we can be doing with the dogs. But within that, I always say that we land into basically 4 different tiers. There's, other people will say there's more, some might say there's less. But where we break it into physical enrichment, mental enrichment, so good cognitive functioning, where our goal is engaging the brain so they're participating actively in species-appropriate behavior. I think that's the really important part of all of this. We have food enrichment and then sensory enrichment that takes us into olfactory, auditory, and visual stimulation. On a side note with that, it's really important when we're using a lot of the sensory enrichment, especially in clinical settings, we have to tread lightly with this, and we can talk more about what I mean with that. But you also want to make sure that you're not overstimulating an environment, right? I've been into practices before that they have music super loud and there's like so much going on in there that it's like, I get your point, but it's actually a little over the top. Like there's too much impact happening all at once. But those are the basic areas that we'll talk about today.
How would we know when we're overstimulating?
Overstimulating to me is dogs that are starting to fall into more stress signaling. They actually will oftentimes, rather than stay engaged with the environment, will start to become actively avoidant and intentionally try to disengage in ways of trying to calm themselves down. So of course you can get that. Some dogs will also over vocalize, but I find that a lot of the times it's in that more subtle, I'm going to go do something else, or I'm going to actively avoid this interaction, that can tell us that overstimulation is starting to happen.
And if I look at the vet rehab practices, we're quite fortunate in that they're not that similar to veterinary practices.
Right.
Sometimes
Right.
they are, sometimes
Right.
they can be quite clinical, but I think a lot of us try our really best to make our vet rehab practices quite homely.
Absolutely.
And we really want the patients that we're treating to be relaxed and calm. And so like if I think about my practice, I had, like couches and chairs, and we sat on the floor, and, even my consult room didn't look like the average veterinary consult room. And so, I mean, those are obviously steps that vet rehabbers are making already, maybe,
Right.
not even consciously, because they just want their patients. Because when we have a calm patient, it's so much easier to treat them than a dog. And I think about when I was in primary veterinary medicine, those dogs, as soon as they just walk in the door, right, they're shaking and they're so scared.
Right.
And in trying to deal with them, and especially when we were busy, and I think that we've learned so much over the years now about behavior and about fear-free handling and things like
Right.
that. But I think back to the days when I was working in the UK, and we had a list like this of surgeries, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't take the time really. I took the time to try and calm the dog as much as I could, or the cat, or whatever. But we were just really trying to get through the list, and sometimes it was force that the veterinary nurse had to just do force to get the catheter in and get the dog under anesthetic. So we also have time. The vet rehabbers have time, because we spend a lot of time with them. And if I think about my patients, I've had a lot of patients that initially came in were very nervous and very uneasy. And then over time, they associate us with those feel-good feelings, because we're getting all of the endorphin release, and we're doing acupuncture and things like that, and a lot calmer. What are the other things that you can think of that we could do in practice? And we might even have vet rehabbers that are listeners here that are actually practicing within veterinary practices. So not all of us will be treating in a vet rehab clinic, which is separate from a vet clinic. But what are the other things that you could recommend that we could do?
I really encourage practices, and like you said, that there's a little bit, it seems like, within the rehab setting to change the model a little bit. And part of that I tell people is to see if you can create enrichment into your model. And part of that too is to evaluate how can you set up the model of your sessions that are allowing you to be able to, like you said, slow down. Okay, because that's part of the process. Is if we start out of the gate with this is the model, right, that we're going to take a little bit of a slower approach, in that allows us to create clinical and really great therapeutic relationships. So like you said, you can heal that experience for the dogs, and they want to keep coming back. So within that, I say some of the ways that you can encourage this slowing down process out of the gate is, I most of the time will encourage owners to arrive early and allow their dogs a good 10 to 15 minutes of just going out and sniffing around before they even walk in the door, just going for some exploratory sniffing. We have a lot of great research and evidence now that let us know that sniffing is just as beneficial as a lot of the other outlets. It allows for de-stressing, exploration, investigation. A lot of the times it can keep dogs in a curiosity brain. That's one of the things that I really tell people is try to keep them curious, because if you can keep them curious, then they feel empowered to want to investigate things, versus once we start to get into the point that that curiosity is gone, then we can start to get really fearful. So that's one of the biggest things that I say is encourage owners to arrive early, because that stops the rush. And it starts the dog off on a much better position. Another really great thing that I would encourage practices to do is that once dogs get in the door, is to, how do you create a, not just go put them in a pen and wait their turn, but if that's the protocol, how do we create a little bit of enrichment and de-stressing opportunity within that environment? That can be simply done by allowing a dog to, of course, if they are okay to have treats, but to have treats hidden around, right? Rather than a little sterile environment with a blanket or towel sitting on the ground for them to lay down on, what about sprinkling some treats around that environment that's going to encourage them, that even if when they first get in, they're a little bit worried, but as they start to settle in, then they go, wait, there's a treat hiding under the corner of this blanket. I'm going to start to check things out. So once again, keeping them in that place of curiosity about the environment and giving them those really great enrichment outlets. Yeah. I personally wish that, and it's not plausible, right? But one of my dreams and aspirations in all clinical settings would to be create a sniffing room, that the initial 20 minutes of every appointment is a dog that's brought into the safe environment. They're allowed to come off leash. And with it, we have a bunch of different mild stimulating things. So cookies to hunt up and different scents around, and that type of environment that we're allowing them to come in and actually settle in rather than go in the door and get to work. And then once again, like I said, you can also provide different sensory opportunities. Like you said, that so many of these practices are able to create these different environments, soft lighting, subtle music. Places are using a lot of even essential oils, that sort of thing that we're doing. That what I would consider more passive enrichment, that's more of the adjusting to the environment, of course. Like I said, with that, you do have to be cautious to make sure that you are not creating over sensory opportunities in that situation as well. So that's just kind of some of the basic things that I say that practices can start to implement.
So, I mean, listening to what you're saying, like if you have to think of like the 5 different senses, you basically want to go through all of those and see like how can you stimulate them using all those 5. So like, you know, you were saying smell, which is obviously such a big one for dogs.
Absolutely.
And I can think of, you know, the taste, obviously finding the treat, but also smelling for it. But one of the things that vet rehabbers often do is they have these like these sort of little like stick mats. It might be like an image that's got little crevices in it, and then they'll put peanut butter inside and they put it on the treadmill window. And then the dog walks and licks, you know, or maybe they're trying to do a treatment and they're trying to occupy them. They'll get them to lick this little, so obviously like a taste thing. And then, I mean, our certain senses, I mean, just chatting to you now, it seems like the taste and the smell are the 2 main ones. And then the visual and hearing and touch, I suppose, is the other one. Touch, we're usually always touching them. Are those ones sort of less, you stimulate them less, is smelling and taste the big ones?
I think initially those are the 2 important ones, because they're providing that environmental engagement, which allows a lot of dogs to start to settle down. And then of course, when we're using the licky mats and that sort of thing, you're also getting a learned paired association with the equipment as well. Yeah. Okay, so and we can talk a little bit more about what are some of the specific things that will then hop into more of the mental engagement when we're actually doing treatments. But the other ones like touch and that sort of thing, I think initially in that opening, right, where we're creating the initial experience, a lot of the times we don't necessarily want to do a lot of touch and that sort of thing because some dogs might not be ready for it yet. Right? Yeah. So to allow them to settle in is absolutely the first tier that I encourage.
So are there times where behaviorally, you know, sometimes feeding dogs becomes a problem? So like if I think back now, like 1 or 2 of my patients, that became completely obsessed with the treats,
Right.
And it got to a stage where we were like, just remove the treat jar from the room because like we couldn't actually treat him because he was just like jumping around so excited. Is that a case of, maybe overstimulation where it's, or is it just a personality trait or maybe a breed kind of thing?
I think that a lot of the times it could be a training thing, right? If the dog just doesn't have any great self-control. But one of the important things, anytime that we're looking at enrichment, to me, we have a couple of different modes, right? We have active enrichment, which is good, hard physical exercise. And a lot of the times, though, that active enrichment for that dog in particular, that we now know that within active realms of enrichment or engagement, that they can actually get too over excited or too over aroused and are no longer functional. So I think that's the important thing in all of this is you can't do a blanket approach with everybody. In that moment, you have to be evaluating what is the impact for this animal, right? So it's kind of the same thing that let's talk about more active enrichment activities. A lot of people assume that, say, you have a border collie that needs a ton of exercise, right? That's kind of the thing within people's brains. What often happens, though, is that if we get into a lot of these enrichment activities, say fetch, that so often we're actually then repetitively reinforcing too high of a state of arousal and can actually start to be slightly detrimental to that dog because they're just staying in that up, go, go, go phase. So once again, you really have to evaluate for the individual animals, what is of benefit for this animal? And that even with the very active dogs, that we make sure that we're creating passive enrichment activities that aren't going into those really big states of heavy endorphin and arousal chemicals, but where we're getting into more of the, oh, this feels calm and nice and settling and relaxing. Where we're heading more into, dopamine and serotonin and those chemicals rather than the go stuff all of the time. So my guess is with that dog in particular, that food is one of those that shipped him immediately into an over arousal state. And then that they became fixated on it. So absolutely in that situation, you have to evaluate, is this of benefit for this animal? Because they all are so different in how the enrichment will impact them.
Yeah, I mean, the border collie is such a great example of a breed, that it's so classic, the type of border collie, what they're like. They need exercise, they need to be stimulated, they're continually on the go. Are there any other sort of breed specific enrichment ideas that you can share? Because I can think of a whole lot of other breeds. We have sort of, they're more sort of calm, like Cavalier, King Charles Spaniel, that nothing really gets them that excited. Every now and again you see one, but they're generally pretty calm. And then Staffordshire Bull Terriers, they're also quite hyper excitable and can sometimes be a little bit neurotic.
Right. So I tell people the initial starting place is to look at the fact, and of course we have to do a little bit of guessing if we're dealing with mixed breeds, but to understand that every breed of dog originally had its original form and function, right? Border Collie for herding, Staffy for gaming, like all of these sorts of things, that they had an original form and function. And to me, that's the sweet spot of doing enrichment, because once again, so like in my house, I have a Doberman Pinscher and a German Shorthair Pointer. Very two different forms of what they were bred to do. And I account that into my daily enrichment with them. And that with my short hair, we do a lot of seeking, hunting, allowing her to do a lot of her innate instinctual behaviors of go. So with her, a lot of the times I don't play fetch because Lord knows she has plenty of go built in, and she has a very big tendency to live in kind of this wild, hyper aroused state. So yes, I could play fetch with her for 4 hours a day. What I would be doing is winding her up even tighter. So a lot of the times what I'll do is to put her into more of a thinking pattern where oftentimes I will go and hide her balls all around the yard. So rather than that manic fetch repetitive pattern, that she actually gets to go use her instinctual, I'm going to go hunt this up. I'm going to go find this thing, which is really satisfying for her because it's tapping into her instinctual thing. Versus with my Doberman, a lot of the time, some of the enrichment that I would do with him is create opportunities where he actually gets to watch his environment, right? Like he's a dog that would be content to watch the world go by. And that can be very enriching for him. A day being able to look out of a window is highly enriching for that dog because that's his innate desire, is to be watchful and see what's going on. So that's my big thing, is looking at what their original core and function is, right? Hounds love to go sniff. How do we create scent trails? And what games can we play with a hound that allow them to get into those instinctual patterns, which innately are just more fulfilling?
Yeah, it'll be awesome if you were here in South Africa, because I'd love you to have a look at my 18-year-old Jack Russell. So, when you're talking about just wanting to see the world go by, she actually, we live on a corner plot on the water. So we have like a lagoon basically around us. And she actually swims to go visit people. So everyone in the neighborhood knows her. I can't keep her in. And then she actually, there's some public access areas onto the water. Then she'll get there and she'll come and she'll sit at our gate. And just sit there and watch. And we often get phone calls to say, your dog's outside, and we'll obviously let her in. And then 5 minutes later, she's just swum around and gone back outside to sit out there. But she's actually just sitting, exactly what you're saying. She's just
watching the world go by.
Yeah. She doesn't like it because from the inside, she can't see what's happening outside. And I often say to people, luckily we're in a cul-de-sac. So I'll often say to people, no, she's just checking things out. But, it's not really great being the vet in the neighborhood and you can't keep your dog in the house. There's nothing I can do to keep her in. Thank goodness I've got really friendly neighbors. And like I said, my next door neighbor, we actually have cut a hole in our fence to allow her to go over and actually go and visit. And she has no dogs, but she has a bed and a whole a little jar of treats.
Cute.
So sometimes Sushi goes over there and has an afternoon there.
Right. Well, I think that in itself leads us into even adding the piece of social enrichment. So often dogs, like clearly your little dog, thrives off of social enrichment. That's something that's very important for her. But once again, it's that when we look at these individual things, it's determining what's of benefit, right? If you're setting a dog up to have really good visual enrichment, but the dog is alarm barking and panicking all day long because of intruders, that's actually not going to be enriching, right? That's probably going to be more stress inducing. So we really have to, you can't do blanket, this is going to be the best for every Doberman or for every Jack, but to really evaluate if it is of benefit. You sometimes have to play around and find what's best.
You're so right about that social part, because she only does that when I'm not here. So when I'm here, she's with me. She is like my shadow wherever I go. Like we actually joke, because I'll take 4 steps forward, she'll walk, and then I'll stop, and then she'll wait. I'll take 1 more step, she'll take 1 more step. So she follows me. She goes in the car with me to take the kids to school, to go fetch the kids. She loves being with me. So she does that basically when I'm not around.
Right. Absolutely.
So, just listening to what you're saying now, if I think about those dogs that show compulsive behaviors, now, like I'm thinking there are 2 different types of dogs. So one is the bored dog that is not stimulated at all, that starts this compulsive behavior because they don't know what else to do with themselves. Right. And then the other one showing compulsive behavior could be that an owner has completely overstimulated them and got them into that. So, for you as a behavioralist, when you are, you have a case that is a compulsive behavior, you're obviously having to now try and work out which one this is.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. And I have found that within some of that compulsive behavior, like you said, some dogs will actually use that as an outlet for stress relief. So that's, that can be the case. I was even thinking about with that dog that got obsessive about cookies. Sometimes they'll get stuck on something and get obsessive about it as looking for a stress outlet. But then, like you said, there's also the mode of dogs. Like I know so many sporting dogs that become obsessive reflection chasers, because they're not getting enough stimulus. So they're looking for those little blips of stimulus that come into their environment. And it's fun to go point it and then pounce on it, right? So you would see them pointing a spot on the wall, no different than they would a bird. So they're looking, they create their own enrichment if given or if not given the opportunity to do it in other ways. Mm-hmm.
So the other cases that I'm thinking are really important for us are our senior dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of, canine cognitive dysfunction. And we have these cases, maybe we've treated them from when they were younger, and
Mm-hmm.
now they've become older, they've become more arthritic, and all the
Mm-hmm.
things that they used to do, which used to give them enrichment, they're now no longer able to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, as a vet rehabber, I think it is our responsibility to alert the owners to this fact, that
Mm-hmm.
because they're maybe not as mobile, maybe they're not going on walks as often
Mm-hmm.
or as long.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're not able to do the things that they used to be able to do, other ways in which we can enrich them. Are there any recommendations that you specifically have for our old senior dogs, just to
Mm-hmm.
maintain them and them in their environments?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, I encourage people to try to do some form of interactive feeding almost regularly. So we're starting to now know that there's getting more and more bodies of research that tell us that dogs prefer to forage. I hate to use the word work because then it means that they're limited that access. I'm not saying limit access to their food, but creating feeding games can be really, really beneficial for dogs. And of course, you can account in what are they physically capable of doing. Interactive toys like Kongs and Topples, things that you can stuff and place their meals in. To me, that can be such a great enriching experience for dogs, because once again, why eat out of a dish that takes 30 seconds when it can be made a little bit more tasty and placed into a stuffable dog toy and frozen? And now we have a 30-minute repetitive motion, requires a little bit of brain, a little bit of body. It's a nice calming exercise for them. So that's my big thing too with feeding, is that I always look at doing passive outlets. So once again, like lickable, repetitive motions, little licky mats, Kongs, Topples, that sort of thing. And then also looking at doing, how do we do more active activities too? So that could be more of the puzzle toys that they have to actually use more of their body, or to just do simple kibble hides. I do that a lot with my Doberman because he's 13. So he actually, to work through a big Kong might actually cause him to be a little bit sore. He has some neck issues. So I found with him that one of my favorite enrichment activities with him is to just do a kibble trail around my house. And he slowly meanders around and hunts up his kibble in the morning. So, and it's very physically appropriate for him too, because it doesn't require much of his body. So that's my first thing, is creating situations where they're not just eating that boring meal out of their dish. How do we turn their food, since they have to eat anyways, into an enriching experience for them? The other thing that we can look at is, so often, yes, they are limited, right? They can't even make it for a walk around the block if they're not physically capable of doing that. But some other opportunities to think about doing that is that our own front yards change every day, right? There's been different birds that have landed, and squirrels or other dogs that might have passed by. So even doing things like going and sitting out in the front yard with your elderly dog on leash, where they get to check out that new environment, or watch the neighbors working in their garden, or see people passing by. So we can provide a lot of those other sensory enrichment opportunities just in our own front yards, and going to a different part of the front yard. Or a lot of the times what I'd like to do with my senior dogs is to load them in the car and we go sit at the park. We don't go walking because that's too hard, but just to go stand by a different tree and see the sights and smell the smells and be able to get that new information can be very, very beneficial.
Yeah, I love that. Just giving them something new to look at.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Often they get so sort of tied up in their little area, maybe where their bed is.
Right.
And you think about it, when they were younger, they would hop up and come say hello, but maybe now they don't when visitors come. So actually physically getting them up, even if you have to help them maybe with a harness with handles on, and get them and put them in a place where they can be stimulated. And it sounds to me like the visual stimulation for these older dogs is something that we could really look at, because it's not really physically challenging for them, because that's obviously a problem, right? And like you say, like with your dog, maybe having some neck issues, trying to use their paws to be able to hold something is maybe so much more difficult for those older dogs.
Right.
But the visual stimulation is really amazing for them.
Right. And even the piece too, like if dogs do have that small world, right? Like you said, they tend to exist around their beds. But how do we even bring some novel stimulus into that environment, right? So it can be, what happens if you bring a small cardboard box and put a couple cookies in it? Like there's these little tiny adjustments that we can do that we're just creating novel experience for them that can be very, very profound. And some other two things to keep in mind, because I know a lot of people say, well, what if my dog can't do a kibble hunt around the house? That you can do, there's snuffle mats, which basically are rag mats that you can hide their meals in. I, a lot of the times, will even feed out of a muffin tin or an egg carton. There's a bunch of these little things that, once again, it just is a shift, right? It's something new and different that open up that different part of their brain that can be really, really profound for those older kiddos.
Yeah, I love those snuffle mats. My dogs absolutely love it. Hiding things, and you can often get the family involved. The kids love hiding little treats inside the snuffle mat.
Right.
So the other case that I'm thinking about, or cases, are those ones that have had operations. So often you have the 4-year-old Labrador or Springer Spaniel that is used to going for walks, running around, and now suddenly they've had a cruciate rupture and they've had a surgery, and now the surgeon has said, you need to keep them quiet. And other times we have, where they if they have a hip replacement, where we really have to keep them really quiet. And these are ones where I really think that we need to also be able to offer advice to the owners, because if I think now, especially when we're treating those conservative cases, so let's say we've got a hip dysplasia case and we're treating it, and the owner's considering doing a hip replacement. A lot of the time they are so worried, the owners, about doing surgeries, no matter what it is, if it's a cruciate or a hip dysplasia case, they're worried about the surgery, especially if they've got a very lively dog, and they're worried how they're actually going to be able to keep their pet still, and prevent their pet from actually hurting themselves, because they get so like cabin feverish. So what advice have you got for those type of cases, things that we can do? Especially, sometimes those pet owners are actually having to cage them, so when they're not around, they're actually having to put them in a cage.
So first and foremost, I tell people from the behavior perspective, it's really important to actually screen how that dog responds to confinement, and to actually start. So in this process, right, that it's someone that's evaluating, I might do knee surgery, but this is a 4-year-old lab that runs 15 miles a day. That seems near impossible. But part of it is, how do we start to, in the preparation process, actually start to lessen their activity that they're used to, right? So part of it is getting the dog situated so they're going to be prepared to go into this confinement time. Because same thing, if you're still out running them a ton every day, they've got the physical conditioning, they're used to that like major stimulus, and a lot of them don't know how to deal with confinement. So then all of a sudden, if they're in, like you said, if they have to be in a cage and the dog is really stressed by that, that makes it even more complex if we're worried about the fact that, what are you doing to your knee while you're scratching at the cage? So that's my first thing, is to tell people to do a little bit of preparatory work of starting to shift their lifestyle a little bit to prepare for what it's going to be like, so it's not surgery, this super abrupt change. So that's an important part of it. And then building positive associations with confinement prior to it having to actually be part of the piece. So that to me isn't necessarily enrichment, but it's really wise preparation building up to that potential. The other parts of it too is, how do we then look at how can we provide what's going to be as enriching as possible for this dog while still making sure that we're keeping them calm. So, of course, working for food, I'm a giant advocate for that, because why would we waste that opportunity in a 30-second window when we can extend it to 30 to 45 minutes? So, but of course, doing more of the passive activities that just require laying down and working on your food. A lot of also thinking about doing, how do we create more visually stimulating environments for the dogs, right? So I've had clients before that I've recommended, same thing. I get a lot of requests of, oh gosh, I have a 4-year-old dog that's super active, that's on crate rest for 6 weeks. How do we do this? One of the first things I'll tell people is to look at setting up an exercise pen by some door where they can actually see the world go by, right? So whether they're looking through a screen door or a glass door, that it's allowing them to see at least a little, like birds landing by the bushes and things like that, rather than being now suddenly put in this small area with no visual stimulation. Had some people even put up a bird feeder outside of the window that the dog could see out of. So just creating any of these opportunities. Depending on the dog, you can even do things like playing visual stimulating videos in the background or something that just give them a little bit of things. I love to play nature shows, because even if the dog's not watching, they're still getting the different sounds and they're getting feedback, right? Rather than just kind of laying there and being bored out of their mind. So those can be really important things. Another place is, how do we create that same thing? So if you have a dog that's in confinement, what happens if you go take that dog in confinement and move his X pin out into the backyard and let him get some different sniffs there, right? Or bring something from the outside in so they can smell the different things and see what's been going on in their backyard that they can't go do on their own. So those are some of the things that I really encourage people to just, once again, look at all of those senses, but doing it in a way where we're keeping them safe and confined as they need to be. Okay. Yeah. Another piece of this too that I really encourage people, and this goes back into kind of our mental enrichment, and will of course come more when we're doing therapeutic modalities and therapeutic exercises and strength building. But how do we do that in the way that is most enriching for the dog? So that's where I say, how do we actually start to move into the realm of doing operant learning for the dog? So rather than, example of if we're working on, trying to get weight bearing, and a lot of the times to do that, you might be trying to get them to put their front feet on something so they'll weight bear on their back leg. How do we do that in the most enriching opportunity for the dog? And that to me is through operant conditioning and the shaping process, right? So rather than just putting their front feet up on the disc and hoping that they'll put their foot down, how do we actually turn that into an enriching activity? And that to me is through shaping, where we're capturing bits of successive approximations until they're actually operantly learning how to engage with the equipment. That can be so much more beneficial for dogs than just here, engage with this piece of equipment. To me, we're missing out on a really brilliant learning opportunity.
Awesome. Those are some great tips and advice. The last case that I'm thinking of is that paralyzed dog, the Dachshund that used to be able to run around and jump on the couch and do the things that they're not supposed to do, but they did. And then they, have a slip disc, and now we're in the rehab process and still hoping to get them to ambulate again. But they get into that depressed state, where the owner just says like they're just down in the dumps, and and those are the kind of cases where I usually put those into a wheelchair. So even if they're not ambulating yet, I'll even strap their legs up, because I see such a difference in them. If they can run around, they just love it.
Right.
The worry with that sometimes is that they get lazy, right? And they either just drag their legs if you're not holding them up, and then their will to actually want to try and walk again sometimes goes away. But my main thing is when you get those ones that are just depressed, how can we help those cases? What advice could we give the owners in those particular cases?
Yeah, I think once again, trying to normalize things as much as possible, of course, in safe ways. I think there's part of that too, that it's, I think there's probably some unknown stress. I don't think there's ever been any research on it, that it's stressful for dogs to not be able to ambulate, right? Like as a, just as a dog that they need for survival to be able to move, I think that in itself can be kind of stressful for them. So I do love the thought of getting them in a wheelchair, even if they're not making a whole lot of effort, but it's increasing the option is kind of the first part of it. But that to me is one of those pieces of how can we create drive and, once again, curiosity, right? So, but of course, then people are like, how do I make my dog that can't get off of his bed curious? To me, that can be little simple games that you can play with them of, putting out treats where they're having to even just reach for things into, because so often we have a tendency to just come to them all of the time and not encourage that curiosity. And once again, the brain activity to say, ooh, what if I come and get this thing? So of course we have to make sure that we're not over frustrating them. But what happens if, rather than just going up and hand feeding them, what happens if you put their food in an arc that requires just enough stretch where they're having to do a little bit of problem solving within their spatial bubble, right? So I think that can be very good. Oftentimes, same thing, like bring different scents in, right? Go rub a t-shirt on your neighbor's dog, of course, if your dog is social and curious, and come and put it next to them. So they're like, ooh, I smell a different dog. That we can create just a lot of different opportunities like that. And even if they don't seem to be engaged in toys, I think by providing different toy stimulus and different visual stimulus can also be very, very good. And then this, of course, is part two that we can talk about, even some tactile stimulation in that time, of course, provided that it's comfortable for the dog. But how do we provide even some of that mental stimulus, right? Like I'm going to sit down and touch every one of your sweet little toes every single day in a calm and relaxed way. But in doing that, I'm creating stimulus in your brain to try to, make their world as big as possible, even though it seems tiny. Also doing a lot of consistent changes in environment, right? So often, provided it doesn't cause stress, right? So that's the part that if you move said dachshund from their comfortable place in the living room and move them into the kitchen and they seem stressed about it, then of course take them back to their comfortable spot. But simple things of moving them around the home to where stimulation is occurring just naturally, right? Like, let's have that dog sitting in the kitchen so it smells dinner being cooked and experiences the human conversation and all of those pieces of it. So even environmental changes can be really important to get them into new worlds, since they can't get themselves into them. So I think that can be very, very helpful for those little guys too, or big guys, because we know that can happen with giants as well.
I love that. So yeah, I mean, you actually want them to be in the mix wherever things are happening. So you might tend to, let's say, you have the dogs maybe the dog's in the kitchen, or maybe the dog's in a certain room. And then you got to think about, like, where is everyone? Where are the things happening? Then move them,
right. Right.
If in the evening the family are watching TV and the dog used to be able to come there, maybe you're not that keen for them, maybe they're leaking urine, but then make a bed that's waterproof, bring them in and allow them to be around. And I love that idea of rubbing the shirts on the next door neighbor's dog, because, dogs always love the smell of another dog. If you go to a friend's house and then you come back and they're smelling you everywhere.
Or even if they live with other dogs in the household or live with a cat that they can't now interact with, do the same thing, like deliver the message via some type of material. So they're getting that, like, ooh, Spike's been out doing something in the garden. So I think that can be very, very beneficial for them. On a side note with that, though, too, we want to make sure that you still do have that really low stimulation environment, because dogs that are down and not able to ambulate because of the stress of that, I think can feel very also slightly intimidated by the environment because they can't do anything about it. So on the converse of that, we want to make sure that those kiddos have a really calm, extra safe environment. So once again, in a household where there's multiple dogs, make sure that there's a physical barrier. So there's no way the other dogs can bombard, even if out of kindness, but they're not getting stepped on or any of those things. But to make sure we're giving them that almost zero stimulation environment so they can also get really good deep rest where they're not having to be hypervigilant since they can't ambulate. So that's the other important side of that.
They'll be quite vulnerable in that paralyzed state. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it sounds to me like all of our cases really should be having enrichment. But let's say we were in a consult. What are the signs that we would look out for, or maybe the things that an owner would say that would alert us to the fact that this dog really needs enrichment?
Absolutely.
So when you do your first consults, just thinking, just to trigger us to think, hey, like, listen out for these things because we can help.
Right. So once again, our goal with enrichment is to create opportunity for dogs to engage in normal canine behaviors, right? So to me, some of the red flags become when dogs are starting to participate in abnormal, like that are not necessarily species specific behaviors. So that could be, of course, the simple things like that we hear of destruction, right? He's destroying his beds. He's destroying things around the house. That's of course a big one. But then to start to look at those pieces of that, it can even be situations where dogs are doing a lot of over the top and consistent alert barking, or I always say kind of frenetic, manic behaviors that start to almost seem like they're becoming fixed action patterns that the dogs are now doing as forms of entertainment. Because I think so often, if left without enrichment, dogs do get exquisitely bored and then will start to create their own jobs or their own activities. So I think that those are the biggest things, that if we're looking for non-normal canine behavior, that we can encourage enrichment. I honestly encourage enrichment with every one of my clients. I don't care if they come in for house training issues or aggression. Every single one of them are going to walk out of the door with an enrichment plan, just because they're not able to be living their free dog lives and doing the things that they were created to do. But I think that's the biggest thing from a clinical setting. If dogs seem like they're really stressed or, obsessed about things, then that to me is the really big red flag of like, let's start to give them outlets of behaviors to do. Like a great example of this, it's so often dogs that are out in their backyards, and this can be a concern for somebody, right? That if your dog has to go into a place of rest, what if that dog is the type of dog, the second they hit their backyard, they start sprinting and running in circles to bark at all the stimulus outside of their fence? That a really great way to shift that is to just do kibble scatter or treat scatter around the backyard and start to go out and leash walk them. So they're staying calm, head down. We're breaking the pattern of, once again, that's probably their barking pattern has become their own ritual of an enriching activity that engages the brain and the body.
Ashley, thank you so much. You've given us such great tips and advice. And I think that all the suggestions that you've given, I think will really help the vet rehabbers to give those suggestions to their clients to help all the animals that they're treating. If people want to find out more about you, where can they go?
They can locate me on my website, which is complete, the letter K, the number 9 training.com. And I do offer specific one-on-one consulting with vet rehabbers in both learning how to create stress-free environments and to also work with programs like this, like how do we create the best relationship with our rehab patients. So that's where people can find me.
Awesome. For the listeners out there that are interested, I will put that URL in the description.
Great. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I've really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Meg.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about veterinary rehabilitation. For more information about continuing education for vet rehab therapists that you can do online, you can go to onlinepethealth.com. I'd like to thank you for listening to this podcast and, of course, thank our sponsors, Pulse Vet. We thank them for their commitment to their mission to improve the quality of life of the animals that we all love by developing, validating, and providing advanced shockwave therapy at the highest level of support and service. Remember, you can reach them at pulsevet.com or info@pulsevet.com. See you all next week.